Hi everyone, welcome to my presentation for the archival turn in feminism, outrage and order. Today we will be breaking down the author's arguments, we will break down the content of our book and see how it relates to our course. I will provide the reviews and reception of the monograph, I'll offer my impression, and then I will provide the discussion questions for this week. The Archival Turn in Feminism is a book about the feminist movement and archives as sites of resistance and cultural production. And as a result, I find that the book has two central and related claims. The first is what I call the feminist claim, and here the main concept that Eichhorn refutes is that third wave feminists and feminists born after the rise of second wave feminism rejected the methods of second wave feminists. So Eichhorn rejects the claim that there is a divide between second and third wave feminists. In order to prove this argument, Eichhorn turns to feminist archives. She says that the archive is a key site where these problematic generational logics can be loosened and are already beginning to come undone. The second claim is the archival claim, and here Eichhorn posits that archives are sites of resistance, activism, and cultural production that aid in knowledge creation. Attaching these attributes to archives is what constitutes the archival turn. And the archival turn suggests that archives are not neutral sites of preservation or documentation, but are rather sites of knowledge production and activism. So here's a quote from Eichhorn. She says, "Rather than approach the archive as a site of preservation, we should seize the archive as an apparatus to legitimize new forms of knowledge." Now, importantly, Eichhorn argues that the archival turn is a response to neoliberalism. She says that the archive restores what is routinely taken away under neoliberalism. Eichhorn posits that archives allow us to be in time and history differently, and this is a phrase that Eichhorn uses multiple times throughout the book, and it's important for two reasons. For one, if neoliberalism has eroded our agency and tricked us into believing this idea of linear progress, the archive illustrates that history and progress have always been an active fight between those in power and activists who fight for freedom and equal rights. So the archive pushes back against and resists the narrative of inevitable history, and a narrative that says that because history is inevitable, then any attempt to make change is futile. The archive reminds us that people, in this case feminists, have always been organizing to make change, and that they have the power to make change. Eichhorn uses Foucault's theory of genealogy to support the relationship between neoliberalism and the archival turn, because genealogy resists the claim that history is linear, natural, inevitable. Instead, genealogy claims that our present is shaped by power, it's not natural, therefore it is malleable, and consequently it's able to be modified by the people. Now, secondly, because the archive creates the possibility of being in time and history differently, this means that voices that operated in different eras are then put into conversation through the archive. And we'll take a look at what that might look like in just a moment. Eichhorn's argument has a strong temporal dimension, so queer theory, specifically the theory of queer time, provides a firm theoretical basis for the monograph, and I've provided a reference in my essay if you'd like to learn more about this. Like I said, Eichhorn also invokes Foucault's theory of genealogy, and finally, since Eichhorn is a professor of culture and media, cultural theory is very evident in Eichhorn's work, as she considers how zines and feminist archival collections contribute to cultural production. So here's the breakdown of the book. Chapters 2, 3, and 4 are case studies based on the feminist archives that Eichhorn has traveled to. And chapter 1 is really where Eichhorn lays the foundation for the case studies to come. So chapter 1 reconsiders the scrap heap of feminism. And the scrap heap is a concept originating from Susan Faldy, which argues that feminist history is repeatedly devalued, ignored, tossed to the side, not only by external forces, but by internal ones. And this is the generational divide that Eichhorn is concerned with rejecting. It's this idea that new feminists disregard the history of their foremothers, of earlier feminists. Eichhorn argues that the feminist archives that she has traveled to for the creation of this monograph reject the idea of the scrap heap. She says that while older feminist modes of activism might be different or outdated, this does not necessarily mean that they are rejected. Instead, she argues that the scrap heap is not a site of refusal, but it's a site where new feminists can return to in order to rethink their methods of activism and aims of feminism. So Eichhorn conceptualizes the scrap heap as a, quote, playground. Chapter 2 is where Eichhorn articulates her concept of archival proximity. Archival proximity is the idea that archival collections foster intentional and unintentional proximities between different generations of feminists. So the archive opens up channels of communication. Eichhorn provides a personal anecdote to further her argument here. So as she's combing through the zine collections at the Sally Bingham Center, she comes across a zine created during third wave feminism called The Bitch Manifesto. She learns that the zine is a verbatim reprint of a manifesto of the same title from 1970, which is, you guessed it, the era of second wave feminism. Inside the zine's cover, the one created during third wave feminism, there is a handwritten note from the editor that writes directly to the original second wave feminist author of the manifesto, which says, quote, "I hope y'all are not offended that I'm reprinting this without permission. I just want girls today to see it," end quote. This archival find solidifies a connection between second and third wave feminism, and it's one that could only be opened and be made visible through the archive. And as Eichhorn is also continuing this, she sees that third wave feminist zines are also a continuation of earlier feminist participatory media like second wave feminist newspapers and first wave feminist scrapbooks. So chapter 3, in class we've already talked about knowledge and knowledge production, and this is an opportunity to bring the archive directly into that conversation and to consider how the archive can aid in the knowledge creation and also legitimize knowledge. So just some background information. Riot Grrrl was a feminist punk movement that was created in the 1990s on the Evergreen State College campus in Olympia, Washington. And between 2009 and 2010, librarian Lisa Darms, who also went to Evergreen, facilitated the development of the Riot Grrrl collection at NYU. So the collection now lives at NYU and houses the personal papers of the founding members of the movement. Because Riot Grrrl was an underground punk movement, some felt that housing the collection at a private university at NYU felt incongruous with the values of Riot Grrrl. Eichhorn argues that NYU is actually the right place for the Riot Grrrl movement collection because of the intellectual underpinnings of the movement. So for a long time, Riot Grrrl was associated with youthful rebellion, but really, Riot Grrrl was a deeply intellectual, philosophical, and political movement. So Kathleen Hanna, pictured here, she was one of the movement's founders, and she now has her papers in the NYU collection. And as Eichhorn is combing through the archive, she comes across Hanna's reading list, which includes articles and clippings regarding literary criticism, feminist philosophy, and postmodernity. You might see some familiar names here. We have Bell Hooks, Judith Butler, William Burroughs. Now, Eichhorn argues that the movement's origins on a liberal arts college and this personal reading inventory from one of the founding members is, quote, by no means inconsequential to understanding the political and intellectual roots of the movement, end quote. Because the Riot Grrrl collection is housed at an academic institution like NYU, this now means that Riot Grrrl can be in conversation with the theories and bodies of thought that were informing its creation as a movement. And as a result, Riot Grrrl is not merely preserved, it absolutely is preserved in the NYU collection, but it's also legitimized. So here's a nice quote that Eichhorn says, quote, while preservation remains the central goal of the Riot Grrrl collection, the collection also serves other purposes, most notably to legitimize materials that may otherwise slip into historical oblivion and authorize them as cultural rather than exclusively subcultural products. Chapter 4 also connects to our class. We've recently discussed classification, and this is an opportunity to contemplate the impact of classification in a library setting. Chapter 4 focuses on the radical cataloging efforts of Jenna Friedman. She's the founder of the Barnard Zine Library. Friedman's objective is to render zines and other third-wave feminist publications like Riot Grrrl more visible and accessible, and we'll be talking about the implications of this in one of our discussion posts this week. So in order to do this, Friedman proposed to digitize print zines and to catalog zines in WorldCat, and this is what Eichhorn deems radical cataloging. So this theory of radical cataloging can be traced back to this 1971 book, Prejudices and Antipathies, and this book from 1971 argues that the Library of Congress has a detailed cataloging system, but this system and the subsequent subject headings it produces can be entrenched in dominant ideologies. So radical cataloging is the act of transforming the catalog into a site of activism by using inclusive headings and being attentive to how headings can perpetuate dominant ideologies and be, quote, inhospitable to certain kinds of knowledge. From what I've read in scholarly journals for archival scholarship and feminist scholarship, the book has been well received. The reviews celebrate Eichhorn's ability to put the feminist field and the archival field in conversation with one another, and some reviews also commend Eichhorn for not only focusing on the archival collections, but also paying attention to the, quote, radical tactics of the archivists and librarians who are bringing these collections to life. So I have a critique. It aligns with the review by Holly Ingleton in the Feminist Review here on the right. And Ingleton writes that Eichhorn fails to, quote, address a legacy of Western feminism that continues to place white subjects as the only subjects of the story without examination, end quote. I think that the lack of diversity is the most prominent weakness in Eichhorn's monograph. I have not visited these collections, so I can't exactly say if there are things in these collections that Eichhorn just hasn't paid attention to, but I do think the lack of diversity in the monograph does raise the question of who gets to be documented in the archive, especially when you consider that there were movements happening concurrently. So Sister Girl Riot is a movement that was actually a direct response to the lack of inclusivity in the Riot Grrrl movement. It was a feminist punk rock movement for women of color. And I do wonder why Eichhorn didn't include this in her monograph. I think it would have made it really much more rich. And also, Eichhorn ends her monograph with saying what makes archives sites of knowledge, or like she says here, potential sites of resistance, is not just the fact that these collections exist somewhere in the world. It's how they're used, and it's how they're used by researchers. So seeing that Eichhorn is a scholar, she's a researcher, she's researching these collections for the creation of her monograph, it does raise the question of why, as a researcher, she didn't consider this movement, and it raises the question of who gets to be a subject of research. And to end, here are our discussion questions this week. We have one about archives as legitimizing apparatuses, one about radical cataloging, and then one that asks us to consider, as informational professionals, should we prioritize accessibility or original audience for archival materials when thinking about making archival materials more accessible.